Hi folks, it's Jim Butler, and today I thought I'd tell you some things that perhaps you do not know about Abbey Park. Leicester Abbey, or to give it its full name, the Abbey of St Mary de Pratis, which means St Mary's of the Meadow, was founded almost 900 years ago in 1143 by the Robert de Beaumont, the second Earl of Leicester, also known as Robert le Bossu. He had come to prominence during the Civil War period known as the Anarchy, to the point where he rose to the level of the Chief Justiciar of King Henry II, basically the second most powerful man in the entire country. With that role came lots of wealth, and he started to pour that wealth into Leicester and also into his beloved Abbey, which he started to endow with gifts of monies and land. Leicester Abbey soon became one of the wealthiest abbeys in the country, and it supported a community of about 30 Augustinian canons and monks, whose job it was to not only spread the word of God around Leicester and Leicestershire, but also to support the elderly and infirm and those that needed extra spiritual as well as physical help. Like most religious houses of the time, Leicester Abbey had numerous buildings on its estate to serve both its community of monks but also the wider Leicester community. This included kitchens, refectories, dormitory and even a hospital. But the heart of this abbey, like every abbey, was always its church. Although it's hard to imagine it now, in its prime, Leicester Abbey could have stood alongside any of the great churches of England or Northern Europe. And when in 1168 Robert le Bossu sadly died, it was to his beloved abbey that his mortal remains were interred, here in place of honour at the high altar. When le Bossu died, the earldom passed to his son Robert Blanchemains, who was equally pious and gifted the abbey huge lands, including most of Anstey. His wife Petronilla was also equally pious, and it's said that she funded the refurbishment of the choir of the church here. In fact, urban legends said that a huge chandelier hung from the ceiling of the choir that was held up by long plaits of Petronilla's hair. How crazy is that? One person who we know who helped the sick at Leicester Abbey in the 14th century was Henry of Knighton. He wrote Knighton's Chronicon, which depicts his life and his experiences at the Abbey. He also wrote about how the Black Death affected the people of Leicester, wiping out over half the population of the town in the impacts that had. However, he wasn't very sympathetic when it came to his own brothers at the Abbey, because when some of them died of plague, he said, well, that's because they weren't holy enough, and pretty much that they deserved it. Nice. Unfortunately, not everybody at Leicester Abbey was as holy as they should have been. In 1420, the Bishop of Lincoln paid the Abbey a visit and discovered that Abbot William Saddington was pocketing minor revenues, keeping personal servants, and the bishop even accused him of performing magic, including divination. If you think that's bad, wait till we hear about the next guy. In 1518, the then Bishop of Lincoln returned to Leicester, where he found Abbot Richard Pascal. Not only was Pascal also pocketing monies that he shouldn't have been doing, he was known to keep an excessive number of hounds that the bishop complained were roaming freely and fouling the church, the cloister and the chapter house. On a follow-up visit 3 years later, the bishop discovered that things had not improved. In fact, this time, Abbot Pascal was rarely attending services, and when he did, he would bring his jester, who was known to disturb the services with his buffoonery. The abbot's bad example was also rubbing off on the other monks, who now weren't taking meals when they should be, wandering into town, visiting the alehouses and going hunting. Not very monkly behaviour at all. So why didn't the bishop just fire him? The problem was, Robert Pascal was sending bribes to King Henry VIII's number one man, Thomas Cromwell, so he couldn't get anything to stick. It took another 5 years before the bishop got rid of him, by essentially getting him to agree to retire. So eventually in 1534, Abbot Pascal retires on a massive £100 a year pension, and all for the fact that he left the Abbey over £1,000 in debt. Shocking. Perhaps the most famous visitor to Leicester Abbey was, of course, Cardinal Robert Wolsey. Wolsey was Henry VIII's right-hand man for many years, but his failure in the king's great matter, i.e. to obtain a divorce from Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, meant that Wolsey fell out of favour. On the 6th of November, Henry sent troops to Cawood Palace near York to arrest Wolsey, and he is brought back towards London to face trial and most likely execution. They stop here at Leicester on the 26th of November, and Wolsey says, "Father Abbot, I have come hither to leave my bones among you." 4 days later, Wolsey dies and is buried at the Abbey, although numerous excavations, sadly, have yet failed to find his bones. In 1538, almost exactly 400 years after it was built, the mighty Abbey at Leicester is closed and handed over to the Crown as part of the Dissolution. A year later, the land is leased to Dr. Francis Cave, who then spends the next 12 years systematically stripping all the buildings, demolish them brick by brick, stone by stone, and selling the stone to the people of Leicester for where there is a high demand. Many of the buildings from this point are lost for the next 400 years. In 1551, the Abbey lands are owned by William Parr, brother of the former Queen Catherine Parr. Sadly, he only has the land for 2 years because he supports Lady Jane Grey in her claim for the crown, and so his lands are confiscated for him and he is taken to the Tower. It's not then until 1613 that the Earl of Devonshire, the Cavendishes, are given the property and build what we now know as Cavendish House. When William Cavendish, 1st Earl of Devonshire, takes over the land at Leicester Abbey, he uses the remaining stone to build the impressive Cavendish House and fully intends it to be his main residence. Unfortunately, he dies a few years later, and his wife and family decide they don't want Leicester to be their main residence. There's this other little place in Derbyshire they'd much prefer. That's called Chatsworth House. Leicester then becomes just a stopping off point for the family on their way to London. So when King Charles I asks if he can use the property whilst he's visiting Leicester, they happily oblige. And we know he first comes here on about the 22nd of July, 1642. Unfortunately, King Charles I doesn't prove very popular in Leicester in 1642, but he's back again in August. And this time he meets here Prince Rupert of the Rhine, his nephew, who he makes general of his armies. And then, after what I assume was a hearty breakfast on the morning of the 22nd of August 1642, the King, Prince Rupert and his army leave Cavendish House and head towards Nottingham. When they arrive in the town in the afternoon, they plant their battle standard and officially start the English Civil War. So I suppose you could say the English Civil War started here in Leicester, really. I would. King Charles doesn't return to Leicester until the end of May 1645, when he besieges the town with Rupert. At the end of the siege, Leicester's bloodiest 48 hours, the victorious Charles comes here to Cavendish House, and he writes a letter to his beloved wife saying, "Never have my affairs been in so sanguine a manner." 2 days later, he leaves Cavendish House and makes way to what would eventually become the Battle of Naseby. Although we don't know whether it was at the King's orders or a rebellion by the people of Leicester, shortly after he leaves, Cavendish House is burned to the ground. And what we see behind me is all that's left to this very day. By the 19th century, the Abbey's lands had come into the possession of the Earls of Dysart. In 1876, the 8th Earl of Dysart gave the lands to the east of the river to the town council for flood prevention works. In 1882, the town council had these lands landscaped and opened as a public park known as the Abbey Park. The remaining 32 acres of the Abbey precinct, all of it on the west side of the river, were finally donated to the town by the 9th Earl of Dysart in 1925. What then followed was a programme to reunite the two areas of the park each side of the river. And in the 1930s, whilst that was happening, the ruins for the Abbey were finally rediscovered. And in 1934, the architect designing the gardens decided to lay out these low walls around the lines of the old buildings so that people could see where the Abbey once stood. When the land both sides of the river was reunified in the 1930s, the new, bigger, better Abbey Park was open to the public. And let's face it, we've been coming back here ever since. Whether it's for bonfire nights, mellors, fun with the family, or sporting events, it really has been a part of the city for so very long. So next time you come, do try to remember all the amazing history that's here. And if you do find some dog dirt, then perhaps think, you know what? might be that pesky Abbot William Saddington and his many hounds once again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Cheers.